First, I'd just like to welcome everyone and say thanks for coming. It is the last talk of the day, and I know that's hard work for us all. Today, I'd like to share some observations on real-life incidents and security fails. These are the things that we've seen and experienced in our careers. When I say we, I mean me, my colleagues, and our extended networks, and together we've seen a lot. I'm not a security specialist. I've done a bit of it over the years though, and want to help organisations better manage their security because I've seen what happens when it goes wrong. Lizzie and Scott's keynotes this morning both really hit a chord with me. I'm a lifelong technologist, and I do find the technology interesting in a geeky way. Security technology is a world unto itself. But the thing that really sticks with me is the human impact of some of these events. They can be life-changing for those affected, and it's incumbent on us to minimise the harm that technology does in our societies. It's a sensitive subject, obviously, so the events that I'm sharing in today's talk, unless they're already in the public domain, are not real. They're a bit of a mixture of things, and they're close enough to the truth to be useful, but far enough away to protect the parties that were involved. So where to start? In a public toilet. It's mid-afternoon on a spring day, quite like this one, and our protagonist, an engineer named Sammy, is returning to the office after a lunch. Clearly, this was a while ago, pre-COVID, when we all actually went to offices and out to lunch. Anyway, on the way back to the office, Sammy stops at this public toilet to answer a call of nature. And while they're there, they notice a folder sitting on by the wash basins. After a quick hand wash, they flick the folder open to see what's inside. The content was most definitely not meant to be in a public toilet. After a moment's thought, Sammy grabs the folder and heads straight to the office of the organisation whose name was on the documents. In this case, the folder contained a pack of over 200 pages of highly classified documents. The owner of these documents had, it turned out, also answered a call of nature as they rushed between offices to a board briefing. They'd been in such a rush, they'd not stopped to put the documents in the secure case they were carrying. They traded off what they assessed was low probability of exposure against the certainty of personal discomfort if they were late to the briefing. Unfortunately, they'd put the folder down for a moment in the toilet and simply forgotten to pick it up again. Does it sound far-fetched? Maybe a one-off? Sadly not. A few weeks back, UK defence documents were found where they'd been left in a bus stop in Kent, in England. So what's this have to do with cybersecurity and hostile technology? A fair bit, as it happens. Sorry, my cat has just come to help me present. What qualifies us to talk about this topic? We'll get back to that story in a minute. So our experience, like most of you, generally falls into three buckets. And I want to dig into this a little to illustrate one of the paradoxes that results in high levels of information security risk going unrecognised in organisations. Firstly, we respond to incidents, and we've responded to many. We've watched others from the sideline and we've dealt with the aftermaths. I even go so far as to say we've caused a few of them. Secondly, we also do explicit assessments and remediation. We look at the state of security across applications or portfolios or whole organisations. And then there's our day-to-day work. We deal with security during the course of all of our activities, which is where most of us spend the bulk of our time doing feature development and so on. Now, how does that mix of work map to the average technology estate? Technology estates have a big wedge of what we would call brownfields or legacy assets sitting at the bottom. They make up the bulk, typically around 80%. And mostly we just run and maintain these with some minor evolution. At the other end, we have greenfields. These are our in-flight new full stack builds, and they're probably less than 5%. And in between those two, we have green over brown. And these are new assets that are being built on top of a brownfields base or legacy that's undergoing modernisation. It might just be by extension or modification. It might be by replacement or partial replacement. And that's usually around 15%. So we actually spend a lot of our time looking at less than 20% of our tech estate. And there lies the paradox. Most of our time is doing day-to-day feature development on the most actively developed areas of our technology estate. We tend to think more critically about greenfields development than evolutions or extensions of existing assets. But greenfields and modernisation is probably where our security practices are most mature and evolved too. That leaves a massive blind spot, and it's in this space that we find many previously unrecognised security risks. Anything below what I'll call the attention horizon may go undetected for years, often until there's an incident, and that's why I'm talking about it today. I'm certainly not suggesting that the attention we give to areas of high change and development is unwarranted. Please keep up the good work there. But we need to make some capacity to look in this blind spot before we have a major incident. Lizzie and Scott both talked in their keynotes about the importance of integrity and doing the right thing by the humans around us. Looking away and hoping for the best, waiting for an incident, is not doing the right thing. So what do we find when we look into those dark corners, or below the event horizon, if you like? There's latent risk, and a lot of them. I've had the unpleasant experiences of living through some major incidents as an accountable leader, and of telling other executives and boards that they're carrying extreme levels of information security risk that up to that point they were unaware of. Some of them, including myself, have had really visceral reactions to that sort of news. They actually go pale and sweaty as the enormity of what's been surfaced dawns on them. Risks and incidents of this magnitude aren't just about businesses and careers. They're about your own personal integrity as a leader. They're about your friends and colleagues, your customers and partners who might be impacted. And you know all of these people. Maybe you know their families, and you can foresee that human toll. So what do we find? There's lots of vulnerable code, and this is part of the reason why your security folks don't see these issues. Security specialists tend to make up around 1% or less of the workforce in your organisation, and they don't have a lot of time for looking at legacy application code. Generally, it's the same old types of vulnerabilities. SQL injection, despite being the #1 on OWASP's top 10 forever, is still really prevalent in old code, plus all the other usual suspects. If you're interested, check out Forrester's report on the state of application security for a laundry list. Nigel might pop the link in the chat. We see a lot of vulnerable servers too. A lot of the older workloads are not containerized, so they're running on VMs or virtual machines. I've got a funny story about this one. A team who were responding to a ransomware attack discovered that their patch management system, so that's the system that should be keeping the operating system on each of those servers up to date, had actually left some of their servers unpatched for more than 2 years. They got lucky though. It turned out that due to the missing patches, crypto miners had already managed to take control of the servers that should have been the conduit for propagation of the ransomware across their cloud estate. To help retain control of those servers, the crypto miners had kindly blocked the ports and protocols used by the ransomware for propagation. In the end, a few $100s spent in crypto mining compute time had stopped a really serious ransomware incident in its tracks and alerted them to a glitch in their patching systems. So dependencies, we see a lot of vulnerable and out-of-date dependencies. I guess it's not just about being out of date. Some dependencies, so these are libraries that we import or bits of software that we grab from elsewhere on the internet, have been subject to takeovers by bad actors, so attackers, and now contain malicious code. So even though they may be up to date, your application is compromised. And lastly, another common observation is that incidents in that brownfield space have a very large blast radius, and that's the scope of impact from an incident. This is because old network topologies were often more flat and open than modern ones, meaning that malicious actors, malware, and so on, can move laterally more easily within your network and cause greater damage. It's not just old networks though. That team dealing with the crypto miners discovered that despite what should have been a well-segregated network design, their colleagues had inadvertently opened propagation paths for ransomware when they'd implemented their automated deployment and monitoring systems. So how do these situations perpetuate? This stuff sits around for years and we don't see it. Why not? Mostly it comes down to human factors. Firstly, we get desensitized to it. And I think Diana spoke a little bit about this earlier. It's surprising how often when we find vulnerable software that we're told, yeah, we knew about that from someone close to it, but it's been like that forever. And no one really notices anymore and they don't communicate it. Then there's organizational boundaries. We all know about the silos in our own organizations, and acquisitions can highlight that even more. Post-acquisition integration often fails to fully erase the boundaries between entities, and any boundary can be a barrier that prevents transparent communication of risk. The risk, however, it permeates those boundaries. Reputational impact, for instance, of an incident can affect a whole brand or business group. Not only are there boundaries, there's also a kind of amnesia that accompanies organizational change. People move on, they change roles, and corporate knowledge is effectively lost. Few people want to work on older systems once they've moved on in their careers, even if they know about them. And older systems often lose their owners. They become unloved orphans with many problems, but no one caring for them. Now, remember those people who knew about the issues that didn't say anything? It's unlikely that they were consciously keeping the information to themselves. They may have assumed that everyone knew about it, that someone else would do something about it if it was required. As organizations grow, they move from being environments where osmosis is quite effective, people just know what's going on, to having to be more intentional and explicit about knowledge sharing. Then there's what we call primary task focus. And again, Diana spoke a little about this. And it can be exacerbated by delivery pressure. It's well understood in psychology. When we put people under pressure, their field of view narrows and they don't see what's right there beside them. They only look at this little space in front at their primary task. And there are a few specific flavors of this primary task focus that correlate with high levels of security risk. The most common is growth focus. It's not uncommon for high growth businesses, digital natives, to see growth as their primary task, generating a return for their shareholders and investors. These organizations are not rewarded for being risk averse and may prioritize growth over stronger risk governance. But it's important to distinguish between informed risk taking and sticking your head in the sand. It's also worth bearing in mind that while shareholders, investors may suffer some financial pain in an incident, they're often quite distant from the other consequences. This is where we as technologists need to exercise our influence to ensure that trustworthy behaviour and care for humans are treated as non-negotiables, not as something that's optional and comes after commercial returns on our organisational hierarchy of needs. At engineering level, that translates into prioritisation of maintaining and enhancing security and trust over feature delivery. Code bases don't get into the state that we've found them in overnight. It takes years, sometimes even decades, of imbalanced priorities. And of course, when it goes for that long, it becomes normalised and everyone gets desensitised to it. So what should we do about all this? Well, the first thing I would ask you to do is make sure that your business continuity plan is in good order, because you might need it. It's surprising how many organisations, even those who are aware that they're carrying very high levels of security risk, still have ineffective or untested plans. An incident may result in prolonged loss of multiple critical systems. How is your organisation going to deal with that? For example, there was a publicly reported ransomware attack on Uniting Care in Queensland this year. It resulted in the loss of many of their business systems for weeks, some for months, I think, and they had to revert literally to paper for some of their key business operations. You don't want to be figuring this out when the incident occurs. Make sure your incident response plans and disaster recovery plans are good. Incidents happen, and when it's all gone to custard, it's not the time to be trying to come up with your first response actions for containment and communications. As Diana said, have a response plan, know who's going to do what, prepare as much as you can for it when things are calm, and then test, and test again. Also, check whether your backups are really secure and whether they cover infrastructure as well as applications. As we move into infrastructure as code, that becomes critical. And as I say, practice avoids poor performance. So back to that testing. Next bit of advice I'd have is carry out those assessments. Go looking for problems and be thorough. When we've actually got down to it, some organisations we've seen have had critical vulnerabilities in more than half of their software assets and hosts that sit below that attention horizon. That's pretty serious. Once you've seen what's there, you need to bubble it up to provide visibility and build the business case for remediation. Often the issue isn't so much having one or two really major vulnerabilities, it's actually a lot of smaller ones that are highly interconnected. And you need a mechanism for aggregating these smaller risks and recognizing the multiplying effect of that interconnectedness. By far the most effective method of improving risk management is to shine a light on the risks, talk about them often, and provide visibility to colleagues and to your leadership. The next thing I suggest is securing your path to production for all software assets. These are your pipelines and so on. Many of us have secure path to production in place for our modern assets. We include security tests, dependency management, static code analysis, container scanning, and so on by default when we build something new. So see if you can use some of those same mechanisms for your brownfields assets. It will help you detect issues, enable remediation, and keep those assets healthy in the longer term. Think back to that cautionary tale from earlier around vulnerable hosts. Make sure that your patching actually works. Make sure that you're not missing parts of the estate, those bits below the attention horizon. And make sure that your patches are applied in a timely manner. It's not much use if they're too late. We did an experiment once to see how long it took an unpatched honeypot server. That's an internet-facing server that we set up with the intent of attracting attack to be compromised. It lasted less than 6 hours. It's not a statistically valid experiment as it was a one-off, but it's a solid reminder that patching only helps if it's done in time. Most bad things need to traverse your network to cause damage. So there's things that you can do to reduce that blast radius, like zone and segregate your network. It's a bit like taking a massive open plan warehouse and turning it into a housing estate. You make lots of smaller buildings, each of which has rooms, and you put your assets into those rooms where there's doors on the buildings and on the rooms. Then you build a road network between the houses and you put controls on those roads as well. So your network controls like firewalls and intrusion detection and prevention systems, they're a bit like having roadblocks and cameras on the roads of your housing estate, where passing traffic is inspected and potentially blocked. Network controls aren't a panacea. They're never 100% effective, but they can deliver broad benefits to a vulnerable technology estate. It's worth also remembering that early detection and response is a key mechanism for minimizing harm from an incident. Some network controls can really help with that. Right, we're done. Early? No, not really. We still have a few things to talk about. We need to talk about what else we find when we look around, and in particular, what information has been exposed because it's been put somewhere it didn't need to be. Like those documents in the dunny. I told you we'd get back there, and the ones in the bus stop, and a million other places we put our most sensitive information without good reason. When we do this, we increase the risk that people and hostile technology will gain access to it and misuse it. Misplaced information is under-recognized, yet it is one of the most common causes of incidents based on what we've seen. What sorts of information are we talking about here? To take a couple of specific examples, credentials and keys, so secrets in your source management systems for starters. These are the systems where you store your source code for applications and so on. They are broadly visible to the technology teams and even to some third parties, allowing for misuse of those secrets. If they're in the code base, they'll end up on your laptops or in development environments where they may also be visible to other technology that you have installed on those devices. Sometimes what should be in your private or proprietary source control systems get made public. It happens more often than you might think. It's bad enough that your code gets out there, but do you really want your AWS keys out there? Most organizations run some kind of log management system these days, and they're full of interesting stuff. Access controls on logs are often far more permissive than access controls on the systems of record. And there is often no effective access auditing in place to track who's been looking at what. Weak internal controls, or access controls, on the logs mean that there's a higher dependence on those perimeter controls or network controls, which, as we said earlier, are never 100% effective. A developer running some naive queries when investigating a production incident recently found unexpected customer personally identifiable information, or PII, in logs. PII is a big deal for most organisations, as breaches involving PII typically result in significant reputational damage and may incur some legal liability. It's not only about potential public exposure of this information. There's also an obligation under Australian privacy law for organisations to ensure that PII is used only for the intended purposes. The law treats potential and actual exposure or misuse in the same way. It doesn't need to be proven, just suspected for it to be a breach under the Privacy Act. So having PII in logs unexpectedly may mean that we can't be confident that it has been used only in the ways in which it was intended. And if harm to individuals is likely as a consequence, it may even become a notifiable breach under the Australian Privacy Act. And at that point, your CEO is probably going to be quoted in the press saying how sorry they are. Other sensitive business information and even access tokens are often found in logs too. But again, the access controls are very permissive, making misuse much more likely. The last two slides were specific examples where we see a lot of unnecessary information exposure. Other examples include production data making it into the public domain. Remember that PII in the logs? Well, it came from logged requests and responses to web services. And that stuff is difficult for humans to read, right? But it's probably not a good idea for a developer to take that and paste it into a random online formatting tool. If you do that, the PII enters the public domain, and that is a material breach. You've just compromised your customers' data. What else? There's test data, of course. Kiru and Harmeet talked a bit about good test data practices earlier today, particularly not using production data for testing. Test data is typically subject to far fewer controls than production data. Something to bear in mind, though, is that public exposure of test data that looks like PII could actually result in the same sort of reputational damage that real PII might. Then there's backups. They're copies. They're the copies that you reach for when it all goes horribly wrong. In that ransomware incident I mentioned before, it became apparent how vulnerable backups can be to attackers. The smart attackers will try and take out your backups first. Backups may also be a soft target for anyone wanting to gain access to information. Beware of your personal devices. Who in the audience has ever taken a photo of a whiteboard at work with your phone? As Scott was showing this morning, that once you do that, Google probably knows a lot about it. And what about those collaboration tools that we're all using now? Where is that information stored and who has access to it? Remember this, the pyramid of our tech estate? Unnecessary exposure of information can occur anywhere in the technology estate, but we see a lot of it in areas of most active development, which is a little counterintuitive, as this is where our attention is focused and our practices should be most evolved. The same questions tend to be asked after an incident involving this misplaced information. How did it happen? Or more specifically, how does information end up where it shouldn't be? It's those pesky humans again. We do the wrong things, either by accident, on purpose, or by design. Diana spoke a bit about accidents earlier today. Information ends up where it wasn't meant to be when we don't know what information we're handling. It's unexpected. Or the behavior of the thing we're using is unexpected. Sometimes we just make mistakes. Many incidents where code bases were made public came about when a developer simply forgot which identity they were using in their source management system. We've all sent emails to the wrong person. We've attached the wrong file. What about those PII in the logs? Was that an accident? Well, kind of. No one had expected a full request body to be returned in an error response. And since the whole error was being logged, that resulted in information being exposed without anyone realizing. As Diana said earlier, humans make mistakes. Sometimes we do the wrong thing on purpose, though. We may not have known it was wrong, but these are intentional acts with the intended information. And they happen when security awareness is low. As an example, a marketing team took photos of themselves working with equipment that they didn't usually use for a publicity campaign. Because the people acting as models didn't usually use these systems, but needed to have the right screens open for the photos, someone gave them credentials on a post-it note. And like generations before them, they stuck the post-it note to the equipment. Those photos made it all the way to the company's public website and collateral before anyone noticed that there was an administrator's username and password visible. Probably the most common scenario that leads to purposeful doing of the wrong thing is when convenience or efficiency takes priority over security. That developer who used the online formatting tool was just trying to resolve a production incident and knew of no safer or more practical alternative. Putting secrets in our code repositories is often just easier than implementing a proper secrets management solution. We also copy other people without question. It's human nature. We see someone else do it, so think it should be fine to do the same thing. But think back to what we discussed earlier about desensitization. These behaviors may have gone unchecked for a very long time and become normalized. And lastly, sometimes we design systems that depend on misplaced information. That's when the risk isn't recognized, and often because of that desensitization, and we extend on a bad idea, like using those logs as an integration point so that other systems had become dependent on the presence of PII. We see this occur more when secure alternatives are unavailable or unachievable or impractical. There's sometimes a kind of localized recognition and acceptance of the risk, but it never really bubbles up. Sometimes this happens when we don't adapt to change. Something that was considered okay yesterday might not be required or okay today. So what do we do about it? Executive ownership is really necessary because these are complex organizational behaviors without a single owner. The drivers and behaviors span multiple disciplines who need to work together to address these challenges. That's business, governance, risk, legal, infosec, operations, engineering, architecture, and you need your executive owner to get everyone aligned and working together. Build on your security awareness and capability depth, because without awareness, we don't recognize the risks, and without capability, we can't address them. Frequency counts for a lot when you're building awareness. Just talk about it often. Make the right thing easy to do and consider reuse carefully. Reuse might seem the easiest thing to do because something is already there, but just because someone did it before doesn't mean it's okay. The principle I'd like you to take away from this part of my talk is really simple. Only put information where it really needs to be. 100% of what wasn't there wasn't compromised. There are no doors in this picture. The access controls on this building are clearly terrible, but it doesn't matter if there's nothing there that needs to be secured. And this goes back to what Lizzie was talking about this morning. Data minimization is one way that we can minimize potential harm. This is a busy old slide. It's just a bit of a recap of what we've talked about, and we'll share the deck afterwards for you to refer to. And that's it. Thank you for staying with me. If you'd like to follow up on anything I've spoken about today, please do contact me. Or if you can stick around for a few minutes, we can do some Q&A.
Wow, Pete, I think you just gave away about $100,000 worth of free consulting here today. And that deck of yours, that last slide, gee, that's the checklist for a great report to anyone's CTO about what they can do immediately to reduce the blast radius and change some behaviors around security. So thank you so much for wrapping up so well, completing all the loops, joining all the dots.